on this computer. Okay, you guys, welcome once again to Art 115 Basic Design. I'm your joyful host, James Fritz. This mask is just not doing it for me, so I'm going to do a quick change here and get into something that I can breathe through and that isn't going to fog me up. Yay. Okay, so we're going to do a slideshow today, and we're not going to get through all of it today. We're going to do some of it today and see what happens. The second half of this hour, I wanted to maybe trot out the next project and walk you through the next project a little bit. We won't stay for the whole amount of time for the second hour, but I wanted you to know what's going on with the next project and maybe be able to get a start on it either here or at home, which is just fine. Masks. Okay, so let me turn this camera so that it maybe looks at that. Let me do a screen share and see if I can get to my thing here. I can. So I'm going to do the screen share for the PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. I got, let's see. Okay, sure, fine, whatever. Okay, so here's my, here's how I'm going to do this. Okay, so form and visual ordering is what we're talking about. That's the title of chapter 2. And this really gets into the principles of design. Chapter 1 is kind of like a beginning, an introduction to art kind of a thing, a little bit of art history, why we do art, why is art important to us as humans, you know, all of that stuff. And at the very end of chapter 1, they introduced us to the 5 elements, the 5, let's see, trying to figure out my camera thing here, just a minute. I'm going to stop the screen share for just a second. I'm going to go to my cameras and get to the different camera. Okay, so I've got Ozbot up there. I'm going back to the share screen, going back to my presentation. Yay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to take Ozbot and try to focus him over here on me, where I'm going to be sort of standing in all of this so that my screen and screen thing sort of shows me every once in a while for the poor people who are going to try to look at this online. Okay. So the 5 elements of art, which got introduced to us at the end of chapter 1. Once again, you know, I got 5 fingers. I use that as kind of a mnemonic device to try to remember. It's line, shape, value, texture, and color. Those are really the only kinds of things that are part of our visual perception of reality that allow us to build objects or images that we can share as artwork, designs, or anything else. You have to be able to build out of lines, because lines, linear forms, you know, we're going to talk about that. And chapter 3 is a chapter completely devoted to the concept of line. Shape is the next one, shape. We have to build things out of shapes, images, all that kind of stuff are kind of dependent on shapes. We often build shapes out of lines, so lines participate in making shapes, but lines and shapes, shape is in chapter 3, 2, 3, 4. Chapter 4 is shape, line, shape. Then value is going to be chapter 5. Values are the shadows that are cast and the differences in the amount of light that is reflected back to the viewer. You either get a lot of bright light reflected back, or medium light, which looks like shades of gray, or darkness reflected back to the viewer, which is more like dark gray or black. And so we get this range of amount of light that helps to illuminate us and helps to define us maybe 3-dimensionally or something when we are talking about representational stuff. So line, shape, value, and then texture. Finally, chapter 6, we're going to talk about the actual texture of things the way that we perceive textures, which is just a little bit different. Chapter 7 deals with color, line, shape, value, texture, color. Now, color is something that we are going to run into occasionally here this quarter because you can't talk about art without color. And yet I'm going to take color and make its own little thing for next quarter. Winter quarter is going to be all about color theory and how color works in art and design. So I'm not going to talk about color too much this quarter, talk about color theory a lot next quarter. So come back, stay tuned, especially if you're an art major or a design major, because that's where we're really going to dive into what color is all about. So I turn off one of these, I got one of these on. Let's see how this all works. Is this gonna go for me? No, so I have to do this. Okay. Okay, so, and I have to do it twice, okay. So your authors really like making charts, flow charts, some kind of charts. I think this was that was not a COVID cough, that was something else, like I'm allergic to tree mold, and there's tree mold out there because it's fall. So anyway, flow charts, trying to figure out how to understand stuff visually through a flow chart. Yeah, great, fantastic, wonderful. God, it gets worse the more you talk about it. So the elements of art, line, shape, value, texture, and color, are the things that we work with. It's the building blocks of art. The building blocks of the visual world are these 5 elements of art. Chapter 2 is the green box right here, which talks about the principles of design, the principles of how we organize that stuff in compositions. And so there are 7 principles that we are going to drag ourselves through in chapter 2. 2 main ones that are in kind of in balance or in tension with each other are harmony and variety, because you have to have enough harmony in a composition to hold it together so that it's not just kind of flying apart, and you have to have enough variety in a composition to make some things interesting, to create emphasis on some things, to lead the viewer's eye perhaps through the composition with some kind of order. And so variety and harmony are the 2 big ones. Organizing principles in a composition, and then the 5 other ones are balance, because there are so many different kinds of balance that we will look at. Proportion, the relative size of things in a composition, how they are in proportion to each other. Dominance is another thing about size in a composition, and it really talks about how certain things can dominate and take over a composition. Movement is interesting. We touched on movement already, trying to figure out how our eye moves through the composition and how the elements might drag our eye or move our eye through the composition. And finally, the thing that I'm worst at is economy, using as few elements as possible to get the job done, and economy of use of elements. So it's these 7 principles of organization in combination with these 5 elements of art. That's the entire toolbox, the entire artistic toolbox that an artist or a designer has to work with to create imagery, art, and designs. And you use this and you put it all together, and you are creating. Your author says you're creating space, but we know from physics that you can't create space or matter, but you can organize matter in space to create unified compositions. So anyway, this is kind of weird because it really does encapsulate what's happening in the first 2 chapters, but I like it because I've spent 25 years with it, and you guys are probably eyes glazed over and rolling in the back of your head right now, because it's a lot to try to it's a lot to think about, and so we'll come back to it, but we're gonna kind of plow our way through all that stuff. And the first one, talking about those 7 principles of organization, is harmony. We're going to be talking about harmony and variety. And with harmony, your authors go to great lengths to tell us all the different kinds of ways that harmony can be used in a composition. And so for 5 pages, with lots of different headings and stuff, we're going to kind of plow into this. So on this bullet pointed thing here, we've got rhythm, repetition, pattern, and motif. All of those 4 things deal with some aspect of repeated stuff in a composition. And this is all in chapter 2, and you will see it there. But they're just slightly different from each other, so we're going to look at them one at a time. Then we're going to look at the ideas of closure and visual grouping. And since we already worked with one project where we had a group of elements that were kind of loosely grouped together, we want to go back now and understand why and how elements can hang together as a group or a team or a sports team or whatever. Shared edges and overlapping is bullet point number 3. These are other ways of creating visual linkages in a composition. And the 4th one, the weirdest ones, the ones that are really part of the 21st century and digital art, are transparency and interpenetration, because these are the kinds of things that lend themselves to digital manipulation and how we can even make stronger visual linkages in a composition, kind of in the same space because they're overlapping. It's kind of imagery that overlaps. So that's going to be interesting. So interesting. Okay, harmony is the first one. It's huge, it's big, and it's got lots of stuff that that we just went through, and all those bullet points, all of those things are harmonious ways of holding stuff together in a composition. It refers to the cohesion of elements in a composition. And rhythm is one of the first ways that you can create harmony. So our authors really, really like pop artists. So we're going to see a lot of modernist art in this book, a lot of things from the modern age, and especially pop artists from the 1960s and 70s. Frank Stella was one of those painters. And so he did these huge paintings, 20 feet long by 10 feet tall, these huge installation kinds of paintings that are great for museums and galleries because they dwarf us in scale, and also they lend themselves to really big spaces. This is one of those things, the Damascus gate stretch variation. Now, I don't know what you guys think about this, but we see one kind of shape that is just repeated over and over again in different kinds of ways, in kind of a rhythmic way. It's kind of like a protractor shape. If any of you ever played with measuring the angle of measuring the degrees angle of angles in geometry class or something like that, you might have used a protractor. And so it's this half circle thing with a little line across it, made out of plastic, clear see-through thing that you could put over the top of an angle to actually measure the degrees of that angle. Does anybody do that anymore in geometry class in like 8th grade or 6th grade or something like that? No. Okay, sure, sorry about that. There's this shape that's in here, and he's painting it over and over again, different colors, partial views of it, full views of it, parts of it that are overlapping other parts, but basically all of them are repeated in this rhythmic kind of pattern. So as you're casting your eyes across this thing left to right, you're getting a rhythmic sense of repetition of form in there. Okay. Another pop artist was Eva Hessa, and she was a sculptor, did a lot of installation pieces, worked a lot with fiberglass. And of course, in the early days in the 1960s, when we were all working, well, I wasn't, but I was a child in my sandbox. When they were working with fiberglass, they didn't use masks or anything, and a lot of them got cancers from the different wonderful chemicals that they were working with. And she got a cancer and died. Everybody was smoking in the 1960s. So smoking and working with very volatile chemicals was not a good thing. But this was one of the installation pieces. You know, it would be on the gallery floor, and she made all of these things. They sort of look like waste baskets, but they were handmade, so they have a little bit of variety in terms of each one, so that there's enough individuality that they're not just, you know, a dozen or 2 dozen waste baskets sitting on the floor. But it's this installation of cylinders for you to walk around and contemplate the profound message that's in a bunch of these empty cylinders on the floor. Anyway, regardless of that, we're dealing with rhythm and repetition here. So seen in the use of the same or similar elements in a composition. And so, I mean, we're breaking this stuff down into super simple kinds of things, just like the squares that we were dealing with in our first project. And we're going to be dealing with squares again in the second project. But it's going to be more fun. It's going to be different. It's going to be better in the second project, I promise. Rhythm and repetition. Once again, here's a painting that deals with the idea of a bowl shape repeated over and over again, turned in different orientations in space. Some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them are white, some of them are drawings that don't have any color in them, and some of them have color. A little bit of red, a little bit of blue in places. And all of that is just a little bit of variety in the composition to move your eye around to different little details, to give your eye a place to rest in the composition and a new variation on the theme to look at. Variety is seen in the different sizes, colors, and use of lines or shading that we see in these in all of these variations on this bowl in this painting by Paul Maines. So keep it moving, because that's what we're doing. Pattern is a kind of repetition. It's a special kind of repetition where a thing, a shape or an idea is repeated exactly over and over again. Now, they've given us a really crappy example to look at right here. This is a Paisley pattern from wallpaper. So the entirety of this rectangle would be the pattern that would be repeated above and below and to the right, to the left, to create a wallpaper pattern. And God, this is like from 1992, I guess, but who would ever put this wallpaper on their wall is just killing me. I don't know. Anyway. I would like to think in terms of brick or tiling or masonry. Those are more understandable kinds of patterns that we're used to seeing. And that's a really simple repeated pattern of like a square or rectangular shape in tiling and masonry and that kind of stuff. That would be a pattern. Where the repetition of elements, where size, spacing, and interval is repeated exactly throughout. That's a pattern. So that's the first kind of repetition. It's the simplest kind of repetition. A motif is related to pattern, but it's not exactly a pattern. A motif is an irregular pattern where there's variation from one area of the pattern to the next. This happens to be a photograph of a quilt. It's a modern quilt, and I don't know if any of you have ever done quilting with your grandmother or anything like that, but this is very cool because this is almost like a painting, a modern painting in the way that the use of the fabric and color and, of course, motif and pattern are being used here. Quilts are traditionally broken up into quadrants or quarters. So if you draw a line down the middle of it and a line across the center of it, and you've got 4 equal quarters for the quilt, usually you have a pattern of some kind in that quarter that's repeated in the other 3 quarters. And we can see that that idea is happening here. We've got certain diagonal flowing curves that are happening going both ways. We've got a certain kind of element in here that's a square that has diagonal lines in it, and it's maybe broken in half into like two triangles, and the diagonals kind of flow through both triangles through each of the squares. And you can see that that kind of a thing is our subsets of the pattern. But in this quadrant, the way that these squares and shapes and lines are expressed is similar to, but not exactly the same as it is up here. What the heck is going on up here with this checkerboard thing? I mean, he's got just tiny little variations on a theme happening from here to here, this checkerboard here, going over here to that checkerboard, and then coming down here to this checkerboard pattern here too. So it's based on rhythm, based on a pattern, but it's an irregular pattern. So it's a motif. Motif is a wonderful word. We use it a lot. It makes us sound more intelligent in art and design. Yes, sir.
See, me and you did this. It's our names on the board.
What you and I, Michael and James, the two of us together.
Yeah.
You're crazy. You're nuts. Don't forget to pull up your mask. Okay. All right. Here we go. So Chuck Close just died like a month or two ago, and he's a painter that did super large portraits of people, even going back to the 1960s as one of the pop artists. And he suffered a, I can't remember if it was a fall or a brain aneurysm or something, and wound up becoming a wheelchair user and still wanting to paint these huge paintings, but he's sitting in a wheelchair. So he's in like this 3-story tall loft studio in New York City, where the painting itself is like on a crane. So the painting can get raised and lowered. And he's sitting up there on a mezzanine platform where he can run back and forth in his wheelchair to paint these huge, humongous paintings that are still like 3 stories tall. So the way that he approached painting after his injury was to break it into some kind of a grid system. And, you know, regular grid systems are fine, but you get bored with that after a while. So he took the grid system and turned it, you know, on its edge. And so now he's dealing with diamonds instead of squares. And what he wound up doing was playing with this idea that he could manipulate a basic motif in every square of the grid system, so that each one of them would be a diamond shape with another diamond inside of it that softened a little bit in a different color, and then a little globular thing inside of that, and maybe a little circle inside of that. And that was the basic unit of the grid system. But if he morphs it a little bit, changing the way that the colors are expressed in each one of those cells in the grid system, and sometimes he can take them and link them together so that, you know, 2 of those grids kind of link together, or 3 of them link together or something. Then he can come up with this wonderful way of manipulating the image, so that when you get back from this thing 100 feet or 100 yards, it all kind of coalesces together into this portrait image of a person. But when you get up really close to it, it looks like a whole bunch of little tiles, you know, put up on a wall. And again, the use of a motif in organizing the space of a big painting like this. Rhythm can occur without the use of patterns or motifs. And, you know, lots of artists throughout the ages have been really interested in rhythmic form, but they express it in several different ways within the painting. And a famous artist from the 19th century is this Japanese artist who is a painter and a woodblock printer named Katsushika Hokusai. And so he did this famous series of woodblock prints, colored woodblock prints of 36 views of Mount Fuji. And you can see the date on there, 1829 to 33. So we are talking, you know, almost 200 years ago. He's making these, originally drawings of paintings and then morphing them into woodblock prints. So here we are out in the ocean looking in towards the Japanese homeland and towards Mount Fuji in the distance. And so in the trough of this wave, kind of framed by the waves that are going up on either side of it, is Mount Fuji. And then the waves are expressed here, and we must be in the middle of the ocean, and it is stormy, and you get a sense of a lot of movement, a lot of energy in the waves. And it's really interesting to see how these waves mimic each other in their form, and they also mimic or refer to or are referential to the mountain, the sacred mountain in the background. They look like Mount Fuji too. They share similar repetitive elements, rhythmic elements. So, for instance, you've got the snow-capped mountain in the background, and the snow comes down, and then with the different textures of the mountain and stuff, you get these, it kind of breaks up into kind of rhythmic white, black, on the sides of the mountain. We get the same kind of thing with the waves. We get the white of the crest of the wave happening up above, and then kind of the look of the water in the center of the wave is doing something similar to this. And he's doing other things with other rhythmic elements. All these little fingers where the wave is breaking at the edge of the wave, he's playing with that as a rhythmic kind of a thing. All the little white dots of foam that are happening in there too, that's another rhythmic thing that's getting repeated throughout. And sometimes with the fishermen in these boats right here, those little white dots are part of the gear, or it's part of the fishermen themselves kind of happening. And the fishing boats are even kind of becoming part and parcel and, associated very closely with the waves and all of that, because they follow those shapes too. So we got the fingers, we got the repetition of stripes in the waves, and we got all those repetitions of all the stripes in the waves that repeat what's going on in the mountain too. We've got the polka dots, all the dots and stuff from the little foam spots. And some of that is continued even out here into the horizon and all the way back to the mountain. So you get the idea. We've got rhythmic elements in the composition that are not necessarily a pattern or a motif, but they're still, it's looser than a pattern or motif. It's just an expression of rhythmic form. Okay, and so here's another example that rhythm can occur without the use of really strong patterns or motifs. This is where we've got this kind of movement happening through the course of the painting, but it's not the same shape being repeated over and over again. It's variations on that shape being repeated over and over again, and overlapping and partially viewed and all the rest of it. So this isn't quite the same as that Damascus gate that we were looking at in the first example. It's rhythm without a pattern. Okay. So those were a lot of ways that you can use rhythm and repetition of form to create harmony in a composition. Now we go to the next bullet point, basically. The idea that you can use closure as a way of creating harmony in a composition. And so your authors are giving us 3 different examples here to illustrate the point. One is where you just have just kind of loose total coverage of your compositional space with elements. And this is when I was talking about black squares on a white compositional space being somewhat ambiguous, because they're all spread out and they aren't really becoming organized or creating any kind of tension in the composition or relating to each other. It's doing coverall. It's covering the entire composition. So that's really nice. But as we start to see shapes kind of coming together and starting to become more organized, it pulls our eye together and we start to struggle with it. We start to dialogue with the piece and try to make sense out of it. That's where the narratives come from that we started to try to pull together for the compositions on Friday. So as things start to become a little bit more organized, they become closer together, touching, close proximity, that kind of stuff. Alignments start happening. Loose organization starts happening. And so, we start to see more possibilities for form happening here than we see over here with this very, very randomized, loose application of shapes and forms in the composition. Finally, when you get to the third one, the last one over here, and you see shapes and forms that are much more tightly organized, they're touching, they're closely organized, we see things that aren't necessarily there. For instance, in this first one up here, you see a shape up here, a super shape, a large super shape that we could somehow describe that's the result of this clustering of all of these smaller shapes. And would anybody like to just blurt out how they might characterize that shape right there?
Circle.
It's kind of circular. I might call it an ellipse, maybe an ellipse or an egg shape, because it oval, yeah, because it's a little bit wider or longer than it is tall. So that's, but yeah, you guys got it. You saw that, and yet I am here to say that it is not present. The idea of closure, makes it so that we try to see. We try to create meaning, when we're looking for something, which the mind is always struggling to find and create meaning. And so, we might see this thing and we might say to ourselves oval, but it's not really there. It is just a clustering of elements that sort of resemble an oval, but it's not really one. This one's easier or more like that because, you see both the circle and you see the square in this one right here. But there is actually, because they don't touch, there is neither a circle nor a square there. They are implied, but they don't actually exist because, it's us connecting the dots where we see, the interior is a circle and the exterior is a square here, but it really is just four elements that are close proximity to each other. And finally, the same thing down here. We see this amalgamation of shapes, and it feels like a horizontal linear form, feels like a horizontal line, but there is no horizontal line there. It is a bunch of shapes that are overlapping and touching and in close proximity and organized into something that when we connect the dots, it becomes for us a horizontal figure or line. But there really isn't one there. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And that's one of the tricks, one of the psychological aspects of our visual perception is that we create closure. We try to, put meaning in where there may not be actual true meaning existing in the composition. We get to, finally, good, fantastic. These are some of those other bullet points that we're only going to talk about with one example, which is really nice. So the idea of shared edges and overlapping in a composition. I don't know if you can see this painting really good because we've got red elements that are geometric forms that are sometimes overlapping or sharing an edge. We've got blue ones in the composition that are kind of behind, but they're really hard to see. But anyway, when you've got these shapes and they're coming close to each other and they're either sharing an edge where two things are coming, right up next to each other. I got to get, I guess, on the, where do I get to stand here? When two things are coming together and sharing an edge, or when they're overlapping ever so slightly, then we get the idea of shared edges and overlapping. And that just creates really, really strong visual connections in the composition. The closer that things get to each other in a composition as shapes, the stronger the visual connection between them. So, they can be far apart in their proximity to each other. They become close together in their proximity to each other. They can touch each other, and they can overlap in a composition. And as you get them closer together, they become ever more associated with each other and strong in terms of their visual linkage inside the composition. Okay. And then transparency and interpenetration are going to be the last two. These things really, with the age of photography in the 19th century, and then the dawn of the digital age in the late 20th century and early 21st century, we now have the ability to put images on top of each other so that they're sharing the same space. And that we're calling that transparency, because you get both the idea of the apple, and the portrait of the person kind of locked into the same space-time image, and you can't pull them apart. And so that was never really possible before in the imagination or with the tools available for painters and sculptors and whatnot, until we had photography, because you can do this with a double exposure in photography, classic photography, and now definitely with digital photography and digital manipulation of imagery, we can play with transparency. Same thing for the interpenetration of form. It wasn't something that we actually observed very much in observed reality, so it wasn't really a part of the painting process. But when we deal with digital ideas and digital imagery, we can now imagine and start to play with the idea of real interpenetration of form in space. And so, I keep doing this thing with my fingers of interlacing my fingers together to get this sense of interpenetration of form. But this is where you're really getting things, that are having strong visual linkage between them. So we went from proximity to sharing edges to overlapping to transparency, and then finally the interpenetration of form is the strongest visual linkages that you can have between elements in a composition. So fun stuff. I think I'm going to quit there. I mean, we did one thing. We just did one thing today, and it took us most of an hour to do it because I was slow. But we talked about all the different ways that you can create harmony in a composition, all the different ways that you can create visual linkages and associations between elements in a composition. So on Wednesday, we're going to kind of plow through the rest of it, the other 6 out of 7 principles of organization in a composition. And they'll go much easier than this. This was a big deal. I wanted to switch gears now and talk a little bit about our next project and try to give you try to prime you for it today. So what I'd like to do, we've been together for an hour. I'd like us to take a break and go outside and get some fresh air, hit the bathrooms if you want to, get a cup of coffee if you can find one out there in the world, and come back at like 5 after 10 or so. Come back in about 10 minutes. We will reconvene in here for the lab portion of this thing, where we talk a little bit about the next project. So thank you for this. I'm going to end this for now and see you back here in about 10 minutes. And we're resuming this demonstration now. So for the next project, it's going to be 5 squares, but the 5 squares are 5 different sizes of squares. And so if I can do this where I can be seen, I'm going to try to make a kind of a small-ish square here. And this is supposed to be a black square, 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch black square. And then, a 1 inch by 1 inch, very, very, very dark gray square, dark gray, medium low value square. And then an even slightly bigger, what's this, 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch. This was the size that we used for the first one. And this one is going to be medium gray in value. Then we're going to do a 2-inch square, which is going to be even bigger. And I think I'm running out of space here. I may be like running completely out of space here, but you get the idea. So this is supposed to be 3/4 of an inch, and this is supposed to be 1 inch, and this is supposed to be 1.5 inches, and this is supposed to be 2 inches, and then this is supposed to be a 3-inch square, and this one is supposed to be completely black. And it's always interesting to try to do this on a blackboard, because I think I want to leave that one black, the color of the blackboard, because it's black. And then I'm going to try to color these in to make them ever lighter in value as we go. So the 1-inch square is going to be dark gray. And so it's going to be mostly black with just a little bit of relief on it to make it dark gray. The 1.5 inch square is going to be medium gray. And that's where things fall apart. Medium gray. And so this has kind of a medium half-tone gray to it. And so we go, the 2-inch square is going to be medium light gray. Let's see, I guess we're going to do this, medium light gray. And this one is supposed to be a light gray then. Or what we would call a high key gray when we get to that point. This is supposed to be chapter 6, so it's way down the road here. But anyway, this is going to be a lighter gray. And then the biggest square is going to be the highest key value. It's going to be super light gray, almost white, not quite. I still want to be able to see it as a light gray against the white background where we glue these things in, but this is going to be the lightest gray possible. And so we're graduating the size of the squares. We're graduating the value of the squares so that they can do fun things with each other. And I've got an example over here that I'm going to go grab. And I suppose I should not show you any examples at all, because it kind of gives away the whole compositional store. But there's one. Okay. Since they're handy and since I can get them going here, and if I can stand where the camera can see me, we're talking about a composition where, again, we're creating our 6 by 8 inch compositional space on a piece of Bristol board, drawing it in with black ink, and then creating a group of 4 squares with a 5th square off by itself, and trying to create, how does that group of 4 squares hang together as a group of 4 squares? So you can put them in close proximity with each other. You can create some kind of a curve or alignment or cluster or something that, that makes them work together. Or you can start to overlap them, and that's good. When you're overlapping these squares, if you choose to do that part, I only want you to overlap them so that they still all work as a square. I want to be able to see their square nature, still visible. So if you take one of the smaller squares and overlap it with a bigger square, and all I can see is a little rectangle or a little edge of a square sticking out, then you've taken away its squareness, and I don't want to see that. So it's nicer to overlap the big squares with a smaller square so that the small square will take a bite out of the big square, but the small square does not totally eliminate the squarishness of the big square. Does that make any sense, for you guys? These can be vertical in composition or horizontal in composition. When you decide what directionality this is, what orientation in space, you can write your name and maybe put an arrow on the back so that I know which way it's supposed to go. But you're going to be sampling these different kinds of squares from photographs from the magazines again. So you're going to want a fashion magazine for this, or one of the art magazines here in the studio. I really like that Harper's Bazaar magazine that was on sale this month on most newsstands, because it's the closest thing. It's the most fashion-y fashion magazine that's out there in terms of high quality printing and a huge variety of different advertisements with colors and textures, and also lots of values in black and white photography, so that you've got black blacks and low, medium, and high key grays that you can sample different size squares out of the backgrounds of those things. So that's really important. Here's another one. So again, there's a trick to this, and I will show you the trick on Wednesday. I can mention the trick now. If you just start to go through all your magazines and try to sample out these different sized squares, be careful, try to make sure that they are square and that your cuts are straight and parallel and 90 degrees to each other. I took off a point on the first project if the squares were, what kind of parallelogram-y or not quite square, a little bit irregular. If I took a point off of your thing and you got 9 points out of 10 points, you still got 90%, which is still an A. Your piece just wasn't perfect. And I was looking for perfection. I was looking for accuracy and precision, in everything that we did in that first one, because I'm trying to engender and get you guys thinking about accuracy and precision and craftsmanship in these first couple of projects. So that's going to be the same thing in this project too. I want you to be able to cut out each square and make it square and perfect and precise. And then the higher key squares, if there's something that's printed on the other side of the page that's text or another image or something, sometimes that will bleed through the high key and medium high key squares. So a trick is to cut out a square that's jet black of the same size as like the 3" by 3" square, and glue the black square to the back of the almost white square. And that will eliminate any of the image that's on the back of that square from bleeding through to the front of the square. I don't know if you can see this because, it's a long ways away, but this high key 3" square has a black square that's glued onto the back of it. And I can see it peeking out from around the edges, a hair's breadth, ever so little. But what it does is it makes that high key gray be very, very, very strong. And there's no texture, there's no text, there's nothing that's bleeding through from the back side of that square when it got glued down to the page. But this one does have text on the reverse side of this thing, and it is bleeding through visually just a little bit in the composition, and I can see it and it bugs me. So it's really important, if you can, to try to, if you're going to sample the 3 by 3" square and there's stuff on the back that is in contrast and it's bleeding through, to cut another black square that's 3 by 3" and glue the two squares together. And that way, whatever imagery is on the back side of that square won't bleed through to the front side where we can see it. Now you're going to say, this is, that's nitpicking, James. You are picking nits here. That's being really picky about this project. But again, I'm trying to get you guys to, be sensitive to and consider all of the, technical stuff, the accuracy stuff, the precision stuff on these projects. And so try to get that big square to not have a ghost image bleeding through from the back side is kind of a nice, a detail to attend to when you're doing this. I handed out the project. I'm going to go ahead and, upload this to, or turn on this project, I guess, in e-learning. So now the first project is available for you guys in e-learning to upload your finished project to. The second project will be there with a digital copy of the directions for the second project, and a place to actually be able to photograph and upload this thing to, so that you can turn in the project digitally. We're still going to bring it to class on Friday. We're still going to critique it in person on Friday as an in-person class, but we have to do this, both the digital piece and the analog piece for this project. So you will want to photograph this thing on your iPhone, smartphone, whatever, and then upload it to e-learning, so that I've got a copy of it and I've got something that you've uploaded, so that I've got something I can grade in the e-learning course shell. So that's part of this. I guess I should have added that to this, and I didn't add that to this, but it is in the digital assignment that's in e-learning for project 2. Anyway, God, that was a lot of talking. Is there any questions or comments or anything like that? So this hour of our class is the lab, where you could, if you wanted to, start looking for different shades of gray and different sizes of square that you could sample out, and you could cut out a couple of them today. You could cut out the great big light gray square that is 3 inches by 3 inches or whatever. By Wednesday, when we're doing this, you're going to be wanting to cut out all of these squares and starting to push them around and compose with them in your compositional space. You're going to use the template to make another format frame, compositional space format frame on Bristol board. And then we're going to be pushing that stuff around. And then on Friday, we'll glue it down and we'll critique it again on Friday. And that'll be wonderful. And so you have an option today. You can start that project now if you've got your stuff here, or you want to play with some of the magazines that I've got over on the countertop over there, or you can take off and go get a cup of coffee before your next class at 11. Your choice, but I'm going to cut you guys loose for now. And those who want to stay in the lab and work, I'm here as a resource person to help you out. I'm going to turn off the recording now, and I'll be posting the recording on YouTube and sending out you guys a copy to it on YouTube if you want to see the recording again. But you've already been bored once, so you probably don't want to see it again. So stop recording.